The underlying assumption about what we're seeing, come on. Come on, yeah. We've got innies, we've got outies. The idea is we have evolved familial mechanisms as well. Kin altruism and W.D. Hamilton's rule. It's a brilliant explanation of how it is we could have evolved altruism, the tendency to favor and do things for our family that we do for that we tend not to do for people who are not family. It's a simple rule of cost to the agent when it's less than the relationship to the agent and the benefits. So here's your son or daughter shares 50% of your genes. Here's you have 100% of your genes. When are you going to likely do something for that person? It depends when the cost is less than the relationship times the benefits. Very simple rule that does a beautiful job of explaining how it is altruism could have evolved. Incest avoidance. Why do we avoid incest? Did you have to learn that? Yeah. Did you know that? Yeah. Parental uncertainty. All women know that the child is hers. Men can never be completely certain. So there's parental uncertainty. Are there evolved mechanisms in men that respond to parental uncertainty? What's one of the first things that people say when a baby is born? There's actually been research on this. Looks just like Daddy. This thing has nothing to do with Daddy. Which Daddy? Families, especially mothers, will say this. This is anecdotal, but the idea is that parental uncertainty tells us a lot about how it is we respond to our children. Evolved social mechanisms. I want to get through this pretty quickly. I know we're spending a lot of time. When are you going to be aggressive? When are you going to detect cheaters? Dominance hierarchies. Who's your friend? Who's your boss? Who's your subordinate? And our capacity to reason logically appears to be mediated as a social function. Social psychologists have studied our capacity to be able to answer this question. You give this question to undergraduate students. And here's the rule. If a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. If A, then B. Modus ponens. Okay? Here's the question. Which of these cards do you turn over that will test whether that rule is true? How many say A? It's okay to be wrong. I mean, who cares? Camera's not on you. How many of you say K? How many of you say 2? And how many of you say 7? Okay, let's take a look at this. If a person is drinking alcohol, if they're drinking alcohol, then that person is at least 21 years of age. That's the rule. How do you test that rule? If a person is drinking alcohol, then the person is at least 21 years of age. Which cards do you turn over to test that rule? How many of you think beer? How many of you think soda? How about 25? How about 17? We've got scientists. Social psychologists have discovered that about 90% of the people get this wrong. They want to say A and 2. But when 90% of the people under experimental circumstances, not into beer drinking situations like this, 90% of the people get it right when it's cast in terms of a social cheater detection mechanism. What does turning over K tell you? The rule is if the card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other side. Nothing. If A is true, then B is true. Do we say if not A is true, then not B is true? No. What does this tell you? Nothing. But what does this tell you? What if there's a vowel on the other side? Tells you that is wrong. This is modus tollens, falsifiability. Affirmation of the consequent, denial of the antecedent. These are logical, these are illogical responses to this kind of problem. And we say, well, people can't think logically. What's wrong with human beings? That's why people fail and have a hard time with logic classes. They get this stuff. And so what the heck? It's only this small handful of philosophers that really like this stuff. But then even they have to really think about it. This is the basis. This is falsifiability. This is the basis of the scientific method. Almost everybody gets beer in 17. Because what we've done is recast this logical problem in terms of a social problem. What Cosmides and Tubes is telling us is this ability to think logically, in fact, is a cheater detection mechanism. And we only employed under the right social circumstances. That is, it's cast into a social framework, not stripped of its social framework in an abstract framework. We're much easier to see the relationship here when it's cast in a social situation versus a non-social situation. Make sense? Yes?
Would you say the same thing for mathematics in general?
Yes, absolutely. Mathematics in general. A famous mathematician just came out and said, math really isn't really useful for most people. I don't know why we make people do math. You'll never use it. Mathematician. Very quickly now, evolve, and I'm almost done here, evolve sex differences. This causes people a lot of trouble. Turns out males and females appear to have both short and long-term mating motivations. They're interested in pair bonding with one person for a long period of time. They also have motivations for short-term liaisons. They may never act on it. But imagine what you're underlying when you're laying there, when you're thinking to yourself, the things that you were thinking about that you would never admit to anybody else because it's not right. Turns out males and females have interests both in long-term and short-term mating. As it turns out, there's a difference, and we can test some of this stuff. Take a look at this chart on the left. When you chart the day in the menstrual cycle and chart it with respect to preference for males who exhibit male typical behaviors, the willingness to engage in aggression, symmetrical faces, very masculine faces, a variety of things that suggests good genes. It's called a good gene hypothesis. Look at women who are interested in short-term liaisons are much more likely to select males who exhibit typical hardcore male masculinity, the bad boy stuff, right at the point when they're more likely to reproduce, when they ovulate. Jeffrey Miller did this, and he's a professor at the University of New Mexico, when he took a look at the amount of money that dancers at gentlemen clubs made as a function of when they were in their cycle. They had a lot more money when they're near ovulation. When you're in a long-term relationship, how masculine the guy is and those features tends to be less important. Other things become important. Loyalty, commitment, love, emotional stability, signs that you're actually going to stay there for a long time and make a life together. I don't want to go into this in much more detail here, but this is another chart looking at, this is called life history, looking at females' age and from the 20s into the 60s, it should be 60, and then 20 to the 60s in terms of males' age, in terms of their preference for a mate. Take a look at what happens for males as they get older. Their preference for females become younger and younger. Not true. Say it again.
Relative to their age.
Relative to their age. Relative to their age. And if you take a look at life history patterns, when males divorce and they have several divorces, on average, the next wife gets younger and younger and younger. I'm just reporting the data. What does it mean? You don't see the same pattern in females. These are heterosexual males and females. The issue of homosexual and bisexuality is a very interesting question. Can't get to it right now. And what of cultural refinements? Art, literature, poetry, religion. What do we make of these things? Can they be explained in terms of expressions of basic evolved mechanisms? What do you suppose evolutionary psychologists suggest? Yes. Is there a God gene? Do you have a God part of your brain? Well, you might, but you need not make reference to it to understand the appeal of religion and Godism. The operation of normal evolved mechanisms being applied in ways that make Godism and religion something that's likely to be ubiquitous. Not because we have a God gene, but because we have evolved mechanisms that try to seek out coherence and meaning in the world. We have a tendency to imbue animation in things. And so this is called strategic interference. For us hominids, what's going to cause a greater problem? To assume a thing has no intention when it does, or to not assume a thing has an intention? To assume a thing has an intention when it doesn't?
To assume it doesn't have an intention.
Or to assume that it doesn't have an intention when it does? Which is going to cause a greater problem? The second one. It's better to assume the lion is hungry than to assume the lion is not and has an intention to eat you. And so you make this error of this tendency. We're sort of natural-born dualists. We come to the world and we really are. Very clever research in child development has suggested very early on, children, and you do too, think of the world in two basic categories: living things and non-living things. We kind of divide the world up into living things and non-living things. Turns out you can have damage to the brain that disrupts your ability to categorize living things, leaving intact your ability to categorize non-living things. You can have damage to a related part of the brain that damages your ability to categorize non-living things, leaving perfectly intact your ability to categorize living things. Even very young infants respond differently to interactions among objects that appear to be living versus not, very early on. Are there critics? Well, there's a couple in here, but there are many of them. David Buehler, philosopher at Northern Illinois University, probably has mounted the most systematic attack against evolutionary psychology. This is what evolutionary psychology say. He says that's a fallacy. Analysis of the Pleistocene adaptive problems yield clues to the mind's design. He says, well, we don't know what happened then. You can't make that claim. It happened back then. This is a general argument against evolutionary psych. So you're talking about how do you test this stuff? It happened then. It's not experimental psych. I guess that rules out cosmology, geology, anthropology. We don't say because that happened back then. We can know or discover why distinctively human traits evolved. Well, you have to know what adaptive functions it served. Well, we don't know what adaptive functions it served. Our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind. Well, Jiminy Cricket, in the last 10,000 years, we've had physiological changes in terms of lactose tolerance and intolerance, surviving the bubonic plague. So why didn't we change psychologically as well? We changed in other ways. And the psychological data provide clear evidence for their claims, such as differences on the basis of jealousy in males and females. One of the things that appears to be true is males and females are equally jealous, but they're jealous about different things. You familiar with this? I do this in my classes, and it works out every time. It won't work in here, I know. Because it won't. But that's okay, I'll try it. The cool thing is that you can actually do neurophysiological, you can take a look at the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center of the brain. You can see what